Hello and welcome to this special edition of BizTalk, APEC Insights, fostering inclusive growth in Asia Pacific. I'm your host, Guan. 20 years after APEC leaders met in Busan, the forum makes its return to Korea at a pivotal moment for the Asia Pacific. As geopolitical currents pull economies in different directions, APEC's unique model of open dialogue and voluntary cooperation has never been more essential. How do we harness these trends to foster growth that is not only dynamic, but also truly inclusive and sustainable? To explore this, we're privileged to have with us Warwick Powell, adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology. Welcome. And Einar Tangen, senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Thank you for joining us. And Bunn Nagara, director and senior fellow of the BRI Caucus for Asia Pacific. A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for being here. So let's begin with the most pressing question. In today's climate of rising tariffs and trade restrictions, how can APEC economies move beyond these barriers to foster deeper collaboration in innovation, particularly accelerate cooperation in digital infrastructure and AI governance? Warwick, perhaps we could start with your perspective.
Well, look, it's good to be with you again, Guan. The fact of the matter is that notwithstanding the attempts to undermine multilateralism and open trade globally by Washington, what we're actually seeing across the globe is a commitment by countries to multilateralism and to expanding and facilitating more open trade and innovation and investment collaboration. And we're seeing that through APEC itself in many, many different ways. One of the places that I think is worth looking at is the actual declaration that came out of the event, which was a consensus declaration achieved by all of the member countries. And amongst other things, it makes it very, very clear that APEC members are committed to facilitating the ongoing expansion and deepening of open trading relationships and investment across the board. And it's doing that by setting up very specific objectives around e-commerce, standardization, digitalization of common infrastructure so as to facilitate future payments, and in the end also proposing ways in which common governance approaches can be adopted to help shape the standards and the approaches that the countries can adopt for themselves, but in a way which also enables smooth interoperability with others. What we're seeing is actually not the end of globalization at all, which is what many commentators often talk about. What we're seeing is the emergence of globalization 2.0, in which there is a greater sense of distributed wealth possibilities and where the interconnections between the world don't just revolve around the United States.
But of course, the two largest economies are still at the center stage of the world. Einar, let's take this to you. Following the recent US-China summit engagement, how could this renewed exchange specifically help advance APEC's work on digital transformation and supply chain resilience?
Well, basically, it's a breathing room. I mean, there's a one-year truce that's going on. I guess both sides will see how it's going. But this was necessary. I mean, if you know, they say a dog lives 7 years for every human life, in which case in Trump's 11 months, I think we've lived 77 months on a continual basis. He is just throwing things out there, and it's very hard to keep up. The problem with the world today is, one, a lack of trust, but also predictability. There is, business depends on predictability, so do governments. If I'm going to negotiate with you, I have to trust you, and I have to be able to predict that you are going to follow through. That is no longer a certain thing with the United States, given what's been happening over this last 8 years. So at this point, China is kind of setting the tone. The U.S., as was noted earlier when we were chatting backstage, chose not to come to APEC, and this is indicative of how they see the world order. If it is not being led or dictated by the United States, it's not worth the United States' time. They'll still go to the UN. Why? Because they have a veto. But nothing else counts. And this is not something that came in under Donald Trump. This is something that was started with Obama when he started refusing to appoint or allow appellate judges to be appointed by the WTO. This, in effect, over the years, all the judges are now gone for many years. Last one was during COVID period. So there's nobody there. That's very important because you cannot have finality of any dispute if one side wants to appeal to the appellate court. If there's no appellate court, there is no final judgment. So the U.S. has been withdrawn. China has been stepping in. And what you saw here is the China-U.S. situation was China stepped up. They had a better hand, as Donald Trump likes to put it, and they played one ace, and quite frankly, they have many more, and that was successful in at least creating some breathing. I think for China, it's very important to kind of last out the next 3 years, 2 months. It's going to be very hectic. And imagine they think things are going to change, that Donald Trump will suddenly have a different view of life. The key is to eat up time, have these periods when you have a peace détente, and then try to get the global order moving in the same direction.
Indeed, and seeing China and the U.S. rolling back some of this trade, restrictions and tariffs is positive signal, at least for regional trade. So Bunn, from your vantage point in Malaysia and maybe Southeast Asia, considering the outcomes of the recently concluded ASEAN summit there, how do you see APEC's work on digital transformation complementing or building upon ASEAN's own regional integration efforts?
Well, groupings like APEC and ASEAN have been working on digital transformation, as you know, as well as other issues of the day. For example, there's the ASEAN Digital Community 2045 project, and these are all pulling in the same direction, basically, in order to promote free trade or freer trade. Overall, compared to APEC, perhaps ASEAN seems to have more benchmarks going forward in this direction. ASEAN has been around working on these issues for 2+ decades earlier than APEC, so that's only natural. For APEC, this year's Gyeongju Declaration highlighted issues like AI development, demographic changes, and resilient supply chains, and their respective challenges. The scheduled benchmarks for each of these could be mapped as phased deliverables for APEC, I think, which perhaps has not yet been done as much. At the same time, there can and I think there should be more and better collaboration between regions and multilateral groups like APEC, ASEAN, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the BRICS, SCO, and so on, in the new era of the 21st century, not just between individual countries. This will provide for better resilience in economic growth and development. APEC, as we know, is founded on the main principle of promoting free trade. Unfortunately, it has not succeeded as well on this in doing anything against trade wars, trade restrictions, trade coercion, and so on. And much more has to be done in that direction. What has happened basically is that we are now in the 21st century. APEC is a product of the 20th century, no doubt. But at the same time, what has changed in that period is that when APEC was formed, the US was the unquestioned #1 economy in the world. Japan was the #2 and the biggest in Asia. And Japan has been an ally of the US. But now things have transformed from that situation. China is the #2 economy in the world to be the world's #1 economy in nominal GDP terms within a decade, probably. And also, China is not an ally of the US. So the rest of APEC, the APEC membership, has to adjust to these realities, and this is going to be much more of the case going forward. So unfortunately, the US does not seem to be able to adjust to these conditions. These are greater than any particular country, and I think good enough that we have issues like digital transformation that they're working on, but I think these are fairly secondary issues at best, because the foundational principles of free trade and maintaining that, protecting freer trade, is something which has been focused on much more strongly, and APEC has to do a lot more in that to prove its worth.
And it is encouraging to see this year's APEC stressing on the importance of these issues. And this brings us to our second question, the pursuit of growth that is both inclusive and sustainable. Warwick, in your opinion, what practical solutions can help bridge development gaps and make economic integration more accessible to SMEs across the region, thereby helping to realize the vision of shared prosperity?
Look, I'd suggest that there are three main things. The first one is an ongoing commitment to educating people. Raising the capacity of one's population is foundational to long-term economic development. China's own experience over the course of the last 70-odd years has been grounded on the fact that it has been committed to raising, firstly, the literacy levels of a population, and in more recent times, raising its general and specific capabilities in areas such as science and technology, engineering, and things like that. The second area that I would be focusing on really goes to the heart of what economic systems are all about, and that is the ability to harness energy and transform energy and materials into new higher value outputs that people find useful and need and which improve the quality of life. So investments in new energy technologies that sustain not only environmentally sustainable energy sources but also delivers what is in effect energy sovereignty is the second critical factor. You also touched on small and medium enterprises, and perhaps we could add in there micro enterprises. These are the untapped potential for economic development globally.
Right.
Micro, small and medium enterprises make up the overwhelming proportion of workers in developing economies as well as actually in advanced economies, and unleashing the potential that still resides inside this network of small, medium and micro enterprises is key. One of the things that can do that is actually digitalisation, because through digitalisation we can reduce the barriers of participation for these enterprises, streamline the ways in which they can interact with each other through the transmission of trustworthy information, and ultimately to sustain cross-border trade so that they can reach new markets. And over the top of all of that is, of course, the ongoing development of cross-border payment systems. So once you add those ingredients together, human capacity, energy autonomy, digital networks for micro, small and medium enterprises, and cross-border payment systems, you've got the foundations for economic development across the region.
And there are still a lot of potential to explore, especially harnessing the power of new technology. And Einar, building on that, from your governance expertise, what policy frameworks would most effectively align economic incentives with our shared sustainability goals?
Well, I agree with everything that Warwick has put forward, but education is not just interior. It's not just learn about technology itself or a technician or things like this. There's a secondary part. When you start talking about a multipolar world, multilateral trade, there's a necessity to actually understand the other countries that you're dealing with. For instance, China has that 3/4 of the world. Countries there are the #1 trade partners with China. But the amount of information that China knows about those countries and those countries about China is very sparse. That has to change. The old days, it was just know the United States, know a few of your neighbors, maybe know Europe or something like that. But otherwise, it wasn't necessary to know your neighbors. It was too difficult. You were dealing in dollars. You didn't have to deal with them. Increasingly, as was noted by Warwick, you're having cross-border trade. Now it is in direct currencies that are going back and forth. You're seeing a diminishing of this kind of unilateral world where the dollar is dominant and the U.S. tells you what to do. So how do you reorder this world? One, I agree completely, it's education. Second, also these digital tools which allow small, medium-sized business entities to trade across the world. Just imagine what a force this would be when you start talking about small businesses in China, which are 99% of the registered companies and 60% of the government revenue, now having an outlet. They're not constrained by having to have lawyers and accountants and letters of credit and knowing the exact duties and systems and logistics of getting from A to B. All they have to do now is there are platforms out there. The logistics have been solved. China has created one of the world's foremost logistics systems through ports, rail, road, and then you have the software, you have the companies, Alibaba, etc. They can go forward and make sure it's delivered. Then you have payment platforms, and they're not just Chinese. You go to almost every region, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, you have different electronic payment platforms, and those are going to be much more prevalent. Then this last part, and I think it's very important, especially when you start getting into trade, is having electronic currencies, national currency, not Bitcoin and stable coin and things like that. Those are a mirage. Those are simply, economic tulips waiting to bust out, as I like to say. Many people say, oh, well, but you can make money. Well, yes, until the party is over and you realize you don't have any money left, just like holding 5 tulips that they traded their house in. So at this point, you need a convergence. And a lot of that has to do with setting standards internationally. So it gets back to this issue. Countries have to understand each other. They have to start setting interoperability standards. And this is where APEC can be very useful. It is not like ASEAN, where they set, Bunn said, where they set specific goals and targets. But what they can do is be very pragmatic. They can have these working groups and say, okay, how do we determine what is necessary for private individuals in terms of their security on internet, obviously national security, but without data, all of the AI is useless. If you don't have it, you can't analyze it and mine it. So there has to be more interoperability, and you're seeing this growing at a regional level, because at the top, it is stuffed up. The United States doesn't want anything happening, and therefore, nothing is happening at that level. I think China is hopeful that at some point there will be a change attitude in the U.S. forced by reality, and then we'll go back to a system where it is much more global in this region.
And that's also why China proposed this AI governance initiative, so we can better harness these transformative forces in our economy. And Bunn, from your regional strategic viewpoint, how can APEC build the necessary political consensus to advance this comprehensive agenda of inclusive development?
I think consensus within APEC is very much tied to inclusiveness. From the beginning, APEC has been criticized for lacking inclusiveness in certain areas, and I think it could do a lot more in those. Well, from Europe, of course, they say that it's not represented in any way. But then this is an Asia Pacific regional organization, so perhaps there could be some kind of observer status for Europe. But that's beside the point. Even within the Asia Pacific, I think there is a lack of inclusiveness in APEC that it should improve on. Be more inclusive. For example, in the sovereign nations of the Southern Pacific. They are sort of a part of the observer status of the South Pacific Forum Secretariat. But that's a secretariat from many countries, including Australia and New Zealand, which are themselves full members of APEC already. So the resultant representation of sovereign nations of the South Pacific is very minimal and limited. Yet at the same time, they are affected by the policies that APEC makes for the region. For example, on global warming, they are the first and the worst to suffer from rising sea levels, and they have no voice in APEC. So I think it would be good if they were at least to be given observer status as individual countries in the Southern Pacific, those islands. And also, I think inclusiveness should include communities like youth and women much more. APEC should be about the future, and it's good that next year's summit will be in Shenzhen, and it should be looking forward and therefore include the youth as well. And if you have women groups as well as youth groups coming into the picture much more, then you can work towards more consensus in a way, because the shared aspirations, hopes, and concerns are much more than the old format of geopolitical baggage and so on of different countries. So I think be more inclusive for APEC would work for APEC, in ultimately promoting freer trade without all the trade restrictions, trade pressure, and so on, which have been part of the old format. So moving forward, is very good. In China, especially, I think it is an opportunity and a great one to showcase the success, unprecedented in the world, in where China has successfully combined market forces with state planning for very rapid development on a mass scale. And I think this is again based on economic growth and productivity, which I think APEC as a community can learn from. And next year's Shenzhen Summit is an opportunity, therefore, to take full advantage of these possibilities going forward. Inclusiveness, building consensus based on the larger populations and constituencies, especially youth and women, and also have some great effects, visibility at least for the sovereign nations of the South Pacific in the islands, because they do have genuine concerns.
And there's a lot to look forward to as China will host the APEC next year, the first time since 2014, and hopefully China can continue to play a constructive role in regional affairs. So this year's APEC has delivered the Gwangju Declaration, the APEC AI Initiative, and the Cooperation Framework on Demographic Change. Against this backdrop, how does APEC consolidate these achievements into a cohesive and forward-looking economic landscape for the Asia-Pacific? Warwick?
Yeah, look, converting high-level agreements into practical effect, of course, takes a lot of time and effort. Of course, it's also something that the countries across Asia in particular have a proven track record in. You know, they're willing to commit the time and the effort to engage in dialogue with each other so as to work through not only the high-level agreements, which we now have, but then turn those into operational plans. And look, this really goes to the heart of, I think, an operating ethos that we have right across the Asia-Pacific region, and particularly here in North and Southeast Asia, and that is a commitment to ensuring that big talk actually translates into concrete actions. The time and the resourcing that can be committed to this, I think, is going to be made available. The parties involved, I think, will do the homework, and in many regards show the world that walking the walk is ultimately the best proof of one's various intentions. This is a very different operating ethos to the kind that you get at this stage from Washington, which looks at these napkin agreements, breezing in, breezing out, photo opportunities, and then move on to the next photo opportunity. None of that translates into concrete actions, and none of that builds the kind of trust that you do need, particularly in a multilateral environment. I'm confident that the countries of APEC, particularly drawing on the operational ethos and historical experiences of not only China, but also ASEAN as a cornerstone within the region, will have the capabilities of actually taking things forward. It won't be easy. There's a lot of pressure on these countries, and the pressure is coming in all sorts of shapes and sizes, seeking to peel countries off, to deal with them on a single basis, to, in a sense, intervene in Asia through strategies of divide and conquer, and where those strategies don't work, to fuel domestic ferment and destabilization so as to disrupt the orderly cohesion of Asia and the ability of Asia to move forward. Let's not forget also that APEC overlaps with a number of other multilateral institutions, all of which lend ballast to the ability of these countries to move forward, whether it's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the world's largest free trade agreement, whether in fact it's BRICS. Contrary to President Trump's recent remarks, BRICS hasn't disbanded, but is in fact consolidating. And Indonesia, China are full members of BRICS within the region. And of course, Malaysia and Vietnam and Thailand are also observer members. So this multi-layered fabric, I think, is going to ensure that that despite the turbulence that these countries will inevitably face, that they have the means to hold tight and sail through, if not a little bit battered, certainly will sail through and arrive on the other side with more robust multilateral collaborative institutions in place.
Indeed, I think these overlapping institutions also proves that multilateralism is very important for the region's future development. And Einar, from your perspective, the Ganji Declaration acknowledges ongoing challenges in the global trading system while APEC moves forward with practical cooperation in new areas like AI and demographics. What does this tell us about APEC's evolving role in shaping the region's economic governance amidst a complex international environment?
Well, I don't see APEC shaping individual governments. What they're doing is providing a platform for, Warwick and Bunn have talked about, which is collaboration. How do you set standards? You need a body to do that in. If you can't do it at the UN because you're blocked, you need something else. And everything that Warwick has just mentioned underlies this idea that because the UN is blocked, it's become regional. And countries are coming out. Timor-Leste has been now the 11th member of ASEAN. BRICS is adding more members. They just said they're going to add, what was it? I can't remember. Senior moment. Anyway, these groups have to expand because it's self-defense. They don't have a choice. Right now, because of the indecision, the inability to know what's going to happen next, investment has fallen dramatically worldwide. And to the extent there is investment, it is not investment in new things. It's just moving the pieces around. You start looking around, over 70% of companies around the world are investigating relocating. Why? Not because of the old reasons where it's all about efficiency. Now it's about how do I deal with this mosaic of nonsensical tariffs? Should I be in country A or country B? The problem there is that you can do that, but you never know if Donald Trump is suddenly going to say, oh, I can put an extra 10% on them. Why? Well, they keep exporting stuff to America. Doesn't seem to get it that America has to import things, not because they like Chinese goods, simply because they don't have a choice. These are things that they have to buy, and they're only available through China or through entities that trade with China and then on to other areas. So right now, the economic situation is going to be very difficult for the next 3 years. We're going to see governments fall. That's the necessity of democracy. Democracy is very good at getting rid of governments because they have not performed, but it doesn't take into consideration. It's very difficult for governments to perform in a very negative economic environment. So these are all things that are necessary. APEC is not an answer, it's a process. And the fact that they signed they look through the agreement itself, the communique, it's very clear it's all about practicality. They didn't set standards. They didn't say everybody has to do X, Y, and Z. They said is we're going to continue to make sure that we can figure out a system that works for us, because if we don't, there will be no solution.
Good point. And Bunn, from your strategic perspective, what would you identify as the core principles that should guide APEC's evolution as the premier forum for Asia-Pacific economic cooperation in the coming decade?
I think if APEC can stick to one single, very important priority, which is its founding principle of free trade, then it would go a long way. So far, it has not lived up to that, unfortunately. As Einar said just now, I mean, APEC has been effective in providing a platform for meetings, for leaders to meet, but it has to be more than an events organizer. It has to be effective in ensuring free trade by preventing trade wars, or at least minimizing them when they happen, and also to resolve them and all the trade pressures and coercion that we are seeing nowadays. Very unnecessary. Nobody wins from that. But APEC, whose sole or main purpose is free trade, has not been able to do anything effective against all these ills. So I think that, together with the founding principle for many institutions like ASEAN, BRICS, and so on, of sovereign equality among member countries, That's important because that ensures mutual respect and cooperation, in which case there would be not one single country to which the whole organization and its membership is beholden to, and therefore, well, when there are negative developments like trade conflicts, that they will be resolved immediately, forthwith, so that because no majority would ever favor or even tolerate any kind of trade pressures coming from any particular country. So if APEC can do that, especially with sovereign equality among members, then it would be very successful for what it is supposed to do. Then only can it be a true champion of free trade that it claims to be. Right now, not yet. So there is a lot of work to be done. So we await that kind of success coming from APEC.
Indeed,
Yeah,
it seems.
if I may, Guan, I just want to follow up
course.
on that. The problem here is the United States. The trade war is starting with Washington. And I don't think that APEC can literally just steamroll Washington out unless it leaves. So I understand and agree with your points, but right now the problem isn't the members, it's one member.
True.
One member
That's
chose not
yes,
to even show up at
yes.
the meeting,
But
although he was there.
precisely by not showing up, it is in a way retreating from this process, and therefore the other members can get together more and move forward in the direction of free trade. So increasingly, I think that could be the trend, because all the other organizations from ASEAN to BRICS and all that are moving in that progressive direction. Any major power, even if it's the US, even if it's very important in the founding process, decides to opt out, then that is his free choice. And therefore, even the former Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, when he was asked recently, said that, well, the rest of ASEAN would probably have to get along with, -1. So I think the message is clear. Not that we want any particular country to be out, but if it does not agree with the majority and it decides to opt out by itself, then we will have to carry on. We cannot be held hostage to just one country, however big it may be. So I think that is the kind of conviction that we need from our leaders, to be, decisive and courageous enough to go on, regardless.
Indeed, it's a pity to see that the United States absent from the APEC's meeting, but it's great that the other members are moving forward in the right direction, reaffirming their commitment to the founding principles that are even more essential in the world today. And that's all the time we have. I want to thank our esteemed panelists, Warwick Powell, Einar Tangen, and Bunn Nagara, for sharing your invaluable insights with us today. So as our discussion concludes, we're reminded that Asia-Pacific's prosperity hinges on our collective commitment to innovation-driven development and winning cooperation. By embracing digital transformation, addressing demographic challenges, and strengthening regional economic integration, APEC economies can build a more sustainable and inclusive future. And this concludes our special edition of BizTalk APEC Insights. Thank you for being with us. I'm Guan. See you next time.